Hey, Claudia, how are you?
Hey, Jamie. I'm good. I'm a bit nervous, but I'm happy to be here with you.
Me too. So we can forget the mics and the video and just have a conversation and see how it goes. Thank you for making the time and welcome to Sentientist Conversations. So we've talked, again, it's the first time we've talked in real time, really, but it's been good to have a few conversations on our Facebook group and via Twitter direct messages. And obviously, I've been a long time fan of The Animal Turn, your own podcast, much more professional than mine. But this series of conversations is centered around this very simple pluralistic philosophy called Sentientism, which I'm trying to develop and popularize. And it centers around answering the two deepest philosophical questions and the two most interesting ones to my mind: what's real and what matters. So that's really the center of the conversation, is your own personal philosophical journey in answering those two questions and where you've got to so far. And so the idea of sentientism is that it answers both of those questions in quite a simple way. So when it comes to what's real, it takes a naturalistic approach, suggests we should use evidence and reason to probabilistically, provisionally, and with prudence and care and humility, choose what to believe. And when it comes to what matters, the answer's in the name, and it's sentiocentric. It says anything that's capable of experiencing, we should grant moral consideration to. But it doesn't say any more than that. It's a very pluralistic baseline. But I'm talking to people who both agree with that philosophy and don't, so we can see where the conversation goes. But before we get into those two questions, for people who don't know your work, how would you best introduce yourself and your focus?
So probably the reason I'm here is because I'm now the host of a podcast called The Animal Turn, which launched in the start of this year, actually in February, and it's doing fairly well. I'm really excited. I've had an opportunity to speak to a whole host of people, and the podcast itself is centered around, I make it based on different seasons. So each season is centered around a particular theme. So season 1 looked at animals and the law, and season 2, which is currently underway, and now in hindsight, I realize I should have definitely spoken to you for this season, is on animals and experience. And in each episode, we focus in on a specific concept related to the theme. And then I interview generally academics from a wide range of disciplines about what those concepts mean. And the intention was, when you look at animal studies or anyone who's interested in animal scholarship, there's a lot out there. There's actually a lot more than maybe folks realize. So just having an opportunity to get to grips with what some of these main concepts are and to see how they converge and diverge is really important for folks that are beginning maybe an animal studies journey or just interested in animal relations. And this is kind of part of my own journey as well. So I'm a PhD student, currently undergoing my PhD in geography and planning at Queen's University. And my PhD is my first endeavor into animal studies myself. I don't have a background in animal studies. I have an eclectic array of degrees where I just follow my interests, and it brought me to doing a PhD in geography, but focused in on animal relations. And I approached the folks at Animals and Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics, Apple. They're a research group here in Kingston and at Queen's, about doing the podcast and just saying, I'm on this journey. I don't know what these words mean. I think they're important. Let's do a podcast. And they were super keen. And here we are. So I'm originally, as you can hear from my accent, I'm from South Africa, but I'm definitely a scholar at heart. I enjoy studying, but I often don't know answers. And I feel answers to things are always just beyond my grip. So I think I use academia as a way to just discipline myself a little bit. I don't know if that really gives you a sense of who I am, but...
Yeah, that's great. That's a great intro. Thank you. So most of the conversation centers around those two philosophical questions that I framed early on. And the one I like to start on is what's real. So for many people, that's a story about whether they grew up in a naturalistic or an atheistic setting or a religious household, how they choose what to believe in, and also whether that's shifted over the course of their life. So that'd be interesting to wind the clock back and understand your journey on that side of the philosophical question, I guess, the epistemology. And
yeah, I've given it some thoughts. So I definitely grew up, my household was not a religious household, but we were definitely within a Christian framework, not at the household level, but in a country that is very much, religion is everywhere. It's in the school, it's in saying your school prayer, it's But there was no pressure to be any sort of religion. I never felt that from a young age at all. But when I was about 16, a friend of mine invited me to join her for confirmation. And I went on a confirmation camp and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I met friends. I was very into the church. I was there every Friday night, every Sunday night. It became a really great social hub. And I think I think I've always been a bit prone to thinking about the magic of things and being swept up in it. So even prior to joining the church at that time, I was very into star signs. Star signs were probably the most magic thing in my world. My mother would get me a star sign book every Christmas. I'm a Leo, and I was like, yes, this is exactly who I am.
Yeah.
Obviously, because it just makes you sound wonderful, and it's written in a really general, broad way where anyone can relate to it. And it seems like an easy way out. You want to read your year ahead. You want to have a script that tells you what you're like. So yeah, a lot of my childhood and teen years were straddling those. Both I believed in ghosts. I was very much, I loved the fantastical. I loved reading those kinds of stories. But then when I was about 18, at some point I started asking questions at the church that just weren't being answered in a satisfactory way. I started getting jobs and working outside. And then I met my boyfriend, who's now my husband. And I think he started to challenge me on some of my ideas. And we started to get into some really good conversations. And then when I started to ask questions, I started to just become increasingly unsatisfied by the answers I was getting. Why do bad things happen if there's an all-powerful, all-knowing God? Why are people dying everywhere, or not even just dying? Why are people, being tortured? And the answers, God knows best, it just wasn't enough for me. It just didn't
Mysterious
seem.
ways.
Yeah, God works in mysterious ways. So increasingly, I became uncomfortable, but I wasn't willing to let go of the idea that there was a being, an all-knowing, someone who's looking out for us. So I was agnostic for the longest time, and I think only maybe about 2 years ago, maybe a few more years ago, I was like, nope, I think I'm definitely in the atheist camp, recognizing that if somehow, and I think it's really important to drive home that atheism is not anti-theist, and it's not saying that I'm against the idea of a God, just that currently there's nothing that points me to thinking that there is one. But increasingly, I've got to say that I am probably gravitating towards the anti-theist, in that if there is one, why are you being so shitty? And I know that this isn't going to make me many friends right now, but I don't know. I'm very respectful. I have a lot of friends who are a variety of religions, and and I definitely think it brings people a lot of value to their lives and a lot of meaning to their lives. And I'm not in the camp of trying to discount that in any way.
Yeah.
But in my own life, religion just doesn't play much of a role.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting journey. And it's did you find the questions you were asking were more about the facts and the evidence, or were they more about the ethics and the morality as part of that system, or was it a bit of both?
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest. I just remember asking questions and not being very convinced by working in mysterious ways or someone knows best. And I remember having a day where I'd gone to the church with my husband, and I was like, the pastor at the time, he was really great. I enjoyed listening to him. He's a fantastic orator. And on that particular day, we had a different gentleman in who was giving, and he was talking about roses and damnation. And I sat in this chair next to my brand new boyfriend, and I was squirming. I was embarrassed. And that kind of made me think, well, why am I squirming here right now? But to answer your question, I don't know what sort of questions. I think they're both moral and reason-based. I view the world around me, and I grew up in South Africa, where there's a lot of beauty and a lot of wonder, and it's an absolutely gorgeous country. But there are a lot of problems and issues too, and racism, and you see disease, and you ask questions about the things you're seeing around you, and why it affects some people and not others, which I think is an ethical question as well.
Yeah.
And I just wasn't satisfied by the answers. And I guess that's reason coming in. So I think it's a bit of both, in my view. Yeah.
I agree. And I like the way you frame atheism, because some people do think it's an active belief that there definitely isn't a God. And some people think it is anti-theistic as well. But I agree. I think the technical definition is the one I like, which is it's just the absence of a belief in deities, because there isn't evidence. And ultimately, if there was really compelling evidence, I change my mind. I don't see there being any likelihood of, in an odd way, there's an infinite number of things you could choose to believe in which have no evidence. Sure. So I don't know how you'd even pick.
But I do think it is important. So as much as I might be atheist, and in some respects, I do think it's important that even though we don't believe necessarily in a God or religion, to not frame us as being beyond kind of superstitious belief or belief that seems beyond the realm of reason. I do think and this is potentially why I haven't yet claimed myself to be a sentient or sentientist. I don't know how to say the word properly. Like, I've read your website and some of the core tenets, and something that sits slightly uncomfortable with me is the extent to which reason is the pinnacle of everything. And I do think reason is very important. I think it's how we think through problems. I think we shouldn't be sidelining reason. But I do think that as humans, we're often more driven by our emotion, and we're more driven by impulses to non-reasonable belief. And I think that reason tells me that must have some significance, or it must be important for some reason that we do tend towards believing in ghosts or believing in supernatural entities or star signs or whatever it is. So yeah, I think religion is just one way of believing in supernatural or magical things. And I think we believe in many supernatural, magical things, but I suspect that there's a reason for it. I suspect that this, and I wouldn't want to cast that in a way that makes it sound like it's reprehensible. It does have damaging and problematic, it can lead to problems. And I'm not trying to disavow reason here and say that reason is not something we shouldn't. I'm just suspending the idea that reason is everything. Like, what role does emotion play in thinking through things? Sometimes you might want to do something because your emotion is telling you, but reasonably you shouldn't be doing it. And I think sometimes people let their emotions lead them too much, and that can take you down a dangerous path. But similarly, sometimes without engaging with emotion and just being maybe too calculated or too and I don't know if any of that makes sense, but it leaves me in just a gray zone.
There's a danger, in the same way as I might criticize a religious or a supernatural dogma that's fixed and cannot be challenged by reason. There's a danger that a naturalistic worldview gets to a similar place as well, and that tone often comes across from people who have a naturalistic or an atheistic or a scientific worldview, and it can sometimes feel like they're saying, we have the facts, they are crystal clear, we brook no resistance to them, anything else is fluff and bullshit, that's it, we have the answers, science has the answers, here's the list, and that's it. Exactly. Read the books, job done. And in a way, that's the antithesis of a proper scientific or a naturalistic worldview, because the very power of a naturalistic worldview should have, it doesn't feel like this often, should have humility and doubt at its heart. That's how we get less wrong, is because we're never 100% sure we're right. So outside of formal systems like maths, I think you should never be 100% sure about anything. So your beliefs should be provisional, always open to new evidence. They should be probabilistic. You could be highly confident if the evidence is really good, but you're never quite 100% confident, because as soon as you're 100% confident, you're close to new evidence.
I mean, I agree. I think objectivity is oftentimes something we should strive towards, but it's possibly something we'll never quite achieve because we're shaped by our worlds and our social situations. But similarly, I think we have to also be cognizant of how rational thought, or the idea of rational thought, has been used historically, right? It's not as though rational thought is just this neutral. So I think reality, which is what we're talking about here, operates in different ways. Yes, I do think that there is a world, and there are trees and rocks and a world out there that exists beyond my thinking of it. I'm 100% believe that. But I do think that as humans that are social beings that experience the world emotionally and often cast aside rational thought, what our social realities are a lot messier. And then the question becomes, asking about how these ways of thinking operate. So how is the idea of rational thought operationalized? And that's very different to maybe practicing rational thought. But I think it is important to just note that rational thought is not also devoid of any sort of problems, right?
Yes.
Or at least the people who use it. Women weren't allowed to vote for the longest time. We weren't viewed as people for the longest time because we weren't viewed as rational thinkers. And the same kinds of logics are being used for animals and a variety of other people. It was used as a form and a tool of colonialism and racism, right? Only rational thinkers are able to. And I agree with you. I think sometimes science and the idea of rational thoughts are collapsed as one. There are many ways to do science. Science is not a monolithic thing either. And at its core, I think science is curiosity and questioning what we think is real with, like you say, humility. But I'm just cautious of how rational thought and the idea of rational thought being a superior way of thinking, which I tend towards believing. I'm just cautious of how that's operationalized in a variety of social settings.
I think it's super important to be cautious. And that's part of the reason I use the term evidence rather than science, is because I think there are lots of different types of evidence. So even our personal lived experience is a type of evidence. We can be skeptical of it and we can calibrate it and triangulate it with other forms of evidence. But it's not just randomized controlled trials or stuff that goes on in a lab. There are many different types of evidence. But I think you're absolutely right to be skeptical, if not of the concept of rationality, but certainly to be deeply skeptical of our ability to be rational. And many people who claim to be rational, even ourselves, that's just not perfect. So I think that's entirely healthy, that we need to apply the skepticism that's built into naturalism actually to naturalism itself, and to skepticism about sources of evidence and validity evidence, and skepticism about the reasoning process we go through themselves. And at the same time, part of that humility for me also helps, because I don't think that there's a sort of naturalistic physical world and then there's a separate subjective world of social relations and so on. I think those subjective worlds and those social relations are part of one naturalistic universe. So all of that mess and complexity, which may ultimately even be impossible to completely understand just because of the sheer level of complexity, is all still part of a naturalistic universe. It's just messy and breathtakingly complex and maybe, who knows, beyond our ability to even understand. And that's partly because I guess I do ultimately take quite a hard line, physicalist, materialist, naturalistic view that sees even you and me as, patterns of information processing and energy and matter. But what that doesn't mean is it doesn't mean that you can understand that in a sort of cold, spreadsheet-based, clinical way. All the wonder and joy of a sense of connection and social relationships and the massive emotion, all of those wonderful, messy richnesses are all part of those patterns and those flows. And I think that, in a way, that's partly why I get the same, I think, it's the same sort of sense of awe and wonder and connectedness from a purely naturalistic understanding that many people feel from a supernatural worldview. I think emotionally those things are probably very similar, even though the logic that leads people to those ways of thinking is different. But
how do you view a naturalistic viewpoint? Is that Luna? Hi, Luna.
Yeah. Hello, Luna. Ultimately, I see myself as a biologically evolved physical entity that is more a pattern than a physical thing. And my own sentience and my own consciousness ultimately is a class of very rich, advanced information processing that developed out of it being evolutionarily useful to have an advanced model of the entity as a self in an environment. So I guess I have a completely naturalistic, again, not 100%, but that's my 99% belief about what I am and how I've come to be. And as that information processing entity, I have a particular perspective and a viewpoint that ultimately I can never get beyond, because what I'm experiencing are just my experiences. But I do think it's very likely that, as you suggested, the external world exists and you exist, and you probably have a very similar sort of set of hardware and software because of our shared evolutionary history that I do, that can lead us on to the next question about what matters and how we can have empathy and compassion for others. So that's how I'd frame it. I'd say that, I think I am a pattern of information processing in a sort of physical entity structure that exists in a real world environment that's out there that I can only ever imperfectly understand.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm still learning a lot about new phrases and concepts, and hence the podcast. But yeah, I don't know if I would talk about myself as like an information processing unit. Like maybe that's talking a bit to the cold-hearted.
Maybe a step too far.
But then maybe that's speaking a bit about how I think emotion and feeling is also part of rational thought and evidence. Like you rightfully said earlier, I think everyday experiences are a form of evidence and a way of knowing.
Give me one
Is this
second.
Luna? Hi, Luna.
Come and say hello to Claudia.
Oh, look at that face. Hello.
Don't drink my coffee. You're crazy enough as it is.
How old is she?
We think she's about 2. We're not entirely sure how old she is, but.
Oh, big yawn.
There's a big
yawn.
Yeah.
Good to meet you, Luna.
Are you going to sit there?
I love the eyebrows.
Yeah, she's very expressive.
She's great. Like, I've got a doggo here, Linus, and my roommate's busy taking care of him. He's overdue for a walk. She's got him bundled up, and after this, I will take him on a snowy, icy walk. It should be fun.
Sounds good. You've got a proper winter at the moment.
Yeah, I wouldn't talk about us as processing units, even though I know that's true, and the brain is probably one of the most impressive, not just our brain, but brains in general are just really incredible processing. But I think that does create a kind of disembodied way of thinking about us. And I think there is something significant in recognizing the fleshiness of us and how significant that is for our relationships and our ways of experiencing the world. And I think just the phrasing, processing, and maybe I'm harboring too much on it, but the phrasing of processing unit makes me think of a computer and something that is possibly easily manipulated and codified. And whereas I think, like you rightfully said earlier, we're messy and our social relations are messy. And I think recognizing that's shaped by our experiences and our bodies, not just as humans, but as any living being, that leads us to possibly messier answers. And whereas a processing unit makes me think, okay, we're ones and zeros and we'll end up with ones and zeros, and it's not that neat, it's not that simple. But I think embracing the biology and this has been something I've actually got to say I've struggled and I've oscillated a bit between. Even thinking about reality, I'd often think I'd tend towards a postmodern or a post-human way of thinking about what is reality. Our reality is very much shaped by our world experiences. You and I could walk past the same person doing something on the side of the street, and you interpret it as nothing, and I, for some reason, think something completely different, that this person had a gun hidden under there. What about our world experiences and our social worlds made us react to exactly the same information, exactly the same environment in a very different way? That means that we've got fundamentally different lived realities, even though the physical world and what we were walking past was identical. So, like, I don't know, and I know there are philosophers and people out there with much better grasp on it, but it's something I've contended with, that tension, that there is something there, but still what our lived reality and our lived experience of it is, that's really significant and important.
Yeah, I agree. And the way I resolve it, and I don't know if this is satisfying, I think some people deny it and they do go down the sort of more computational, pure rationality, a scientistic way of thinking. They try and deny the lived experience and the variety of experience and the richness and the messiness. I think other people are so drawn into it that they think it's something separate from physical reality.
Yeah.
So that draws people back to some sort of spirituality, or even in a naturalistic sense, a sense that, our perspectives are so isolated from each other that they are completely and utterly distinct, and we almost do not share the same reality at all. And I think that's going too far. So the resolution for me, and you're right, the terminology I use is probably doesn't set the right tone. No, but it is important, because you're right. You're talking about a processing unit doesn't really give the sense of richness and wonder that I think is entirely appropriate. So I almost try and take the distinctiveness of individual perspectives and lived experiences, and the richness of and the wonder of sort of societal connections and contexts and differences, and a lot of that postmodern style analysis about power balances and negotiations and the subjective perspectives and how distinctive those can be. But I'd like to try and bring that into a naturalistic worldview and say all of those perspectives and that richness and that complexity is still part of our physical world that does actually objectively exist. So those subjective perspectives are still objectively real because the way your brain operates and the perceptions you have are going to be different from the way my brain operates and the perceptions I have because we've got different lived experiences. We've had a different path. Yeah. But at the same time, because I do think we share one reality. I mean, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe we're all living in our own simulations. Yeah. But because I do think we share one physical reality, and because I do think we have a substantial evolutionary commonality that means that, again, this is using the wrong terminology, your hardware and my hardware and our software has quite a lot in common, but given we're both humans, that means while we'll never, I say never, but while it's highly unlikely we'd ever be able to perfectly understand the perspectives of another, we can certainly get good enough to be able to cooperate and work together and to understand each other. We're not our own sort of solipsistic islands. So I don't know if that's satisfying, but I try and bring all that richness and wonder and complexity, but still base it in a naturalistic.
I agree. I don't think we exist beyond the world, beyond our biology, beyond our lived experiences are shaped by our geography, the families we're born into, where we are and what we're made up of also very much shape how we experience the world. Sorry. I just think that I wouldn't tend towards saying that there's an answer as much as, or even, and I've always struggled with the term objectivity because I think that it belies who is saying what is objective and who produces knowledge is also a part of these power dynamics. But I do view objectivity as a spectrum, right? You can tend more towards objectivity. You can tend towards trying to fill in more of a partial picture. If we just acknowledge that our knowledge is partial and that it'll never be fully, like imagine you've got
never
a cake
100%.
tin. Exactly. You've got a cake tin and that cake tin will never be fully full of cake. It's a sad truth, but it sucks. You'll never have all of the cake. But you can do your best to fill that cake with as much varied knowledge as possible, that cake tin at least. And I've been doing a lot of baking. It's that time of year. And I think the word objectivity sometimes gives the impression that there is a single answer, a single way. And earlier on, for example, you even mentioned maths, and you said there are some ways of knowing that are just maybe closer to that realm of objectivity. But even there, I would say that there is still room for. We had a couch surfer stay with us last year, and he's a theoretical mathematician, and I'm not great at maths. I've never been great at maths, but speaking to him about maths was like speaking to a philosopher. His excitement and his interest, and then he would explain to me how they start with a problem. Here's an equation. We don't know how we got to this equation. Figure it out. And what his job is to now work on it and figure out how do we get to that answer, which I view very similar as what I do as a social scientist, where I see, okay, this is an everyday pattern that we see happening. What I work on in my thesis is trying to understand how some animals came to be removed from cities. It's quite clear that cows are no longer part of many North American urban centers, but they once were. So this is a pattern. And my job now is to work towards understanding how that pattern came to be. Same as a theoretical mathematician, but we give a very different sense of validity to what his answer might be and what my answer might be because there are different variables involved, rightfully. But I do think that while his answer can tend closer towards objectivity and mine maybe not as close, I don't think that this now disavows the quality of that type of knowledge. It's not to say that his knowledge is better or superior. But
I agree, because I think partly the only way you can get to something that is more objectively true is by defining a system of thought where that's already baked in, which by definition also makes it less relevant to the mess of the real world.
Exactly. And this is what like lab science does. And this is one of the reasons why, researching animals in laboratories is often viewed as problematic, because you're putting them in artificial scenarios, trying to understand how they experience the world in a way in which they don't really experience the world, or putting them up against ways of human intelligence and ways of knowing and expecting them to perform to the same way. But I do want to say that with this conversation, I'm also cautious and raising a flag on the other end of this is what I do. Unfortunately, my friends hate it. I'm just like, wait, but be careful. And I know it's really annoying. But at the same time, I realize that this whole post-factual world and not giving credence to expertise is also a problem. That as much as experiences need to be valued and no experiences, I don't think that we should be in the business of trying to cut experiences or diminutize experiences. But at the same time, I think that we should create space for understanding people who have dedicated time and effort and energy towards becoming experts or generating an expertise in a particular realm, and recognizing that explanations from all people are not necessarily equal. Yeah. And so I'm trying to like hold those two in tension, recognizing that the idea of objectivity and the idea of all knowledge, some being seen as more superior and less superior, is problematic and can be problematic, but at the same time recognizing that holding all knowledge as being wholly equal on all things is also not the way forward. I think we have to see that we're all finite beings in a finite space, and over the course of my lifetime, what I could become an expert in and what you could become an expert in and where we focus our attention is significant. So what we would be able to be, I don't know if that's making any sort of sense, but I do think
it is.
Yeah.
Because I think we're almost talking about two potential mistakes. One mistake is pretending or acting as though you have perfect knowledge and the search is over and that's the end and there's perfect objectivity and that's the answer. The other mistake is just to give up completely and say anyone's opinion is as valid as anybody else's. I can bump into someone on the street and they could tell me some complete bullshit and it's just as valid as my own experience or my own understanding or my own knowledge. And I think both of those are mistakes. And maybe in different ways, but I think we're trying to find a middle ground, which is about that humility. Ultimately, it's saying we can develop knowledge and we can build it and we can improve it. There is better and worse evidence. There's better and worse reasoning. There's emotional thinking, intuition. There's all sorts of different things going on and it's messy and it's complex. But there is still value and we have an ability to develop a shared understanding of reality and our own individual perspectives on reality, but it needs to be prudent and provisional and probabilistic and always will be and always should be. And as soon as we either give up completely or think we have the perfect answers, we've probably taken a wrong turn. So I think there is something about that middle ground that doesn't give up, doesn't pretend it's perfect, but it's a never-ending journey of sort of exploration and understanding and deepening of individual perspectives. I know, hopefully shared perspectives as well.
Thank you. You said that a lot more succinctly than I did.
Well, but I could talk about that stuff for ages. But I think you've already hinted at how it links to our second deep question, which is what matters in that context. So if for some people who've got a very supernatural or a religious worldview, the morality is laid down for them because normally the deity is an instantiation of what is good and bad. Quite often there are rules to follow, which are often interpreted in many and various ways. But there's a sort of moral system of sorts there. And as you've hinted at already, there's a lot of real good there. There's often genuine, deep, rich compassion, care for the other. Most religions have some form of the golden rule, and there is an expression of concern for others. There's power and richness in the community and the sense of meaning that people get from those things as well. But at the same time, as again you've mentioned, there can be real challenges that, as with you, sometimes make me feel a little bit more anti-theistic than I really want to be, because I genuinely believe people should be able to believe what they like, however crazy. The challenge is when those beliefs are used to cause harm to others. And often we see that come through, either because I think as soon as you believe in something being more important than the suffering and the experience of sentient beings, you tend to cause a lot of suffering and death in the pursuit of whether it's a god or a church or even a one nation state or an autocratic leader. As soon as there's something that's elevated above the experience and life and death of sentient beings, but also just because there are some weird ethics that flow through some of those systems and the way they've been interpreted, whether it's threatening small children with being tortured in hell forever or cruel and unusual punishments or restrictions. There's good and bad, of course, in any ethical system. But one reason some people feel hesitant about moving away from a religious worldview is because they're worried that they'll lose their moral foundations and their moral moorings and what is good, what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. But you don't share that sort of supernatural or religious worldview anymore. So how would you describe what the grounding of your ethics is, if indeed it does have a grounding. How would you describe what matters to you?
I mean, I do think it's possibly more complicated than the fact that I'm not religious, because I did grow up, right, in a Christian environment and setting, which might have shaped the way I view the world. But that said, I don't think our ethics and our morals are grounded there. I think there is enough evidence of people shirking what their religions ask of them to do and choosing something because they view whatever it's asking them to do, whether it's stoning people for being a particular sexuality or not letting their wives sleep in their rooms or whatever it is. Those are really extreme examples. But
yeah, most religious people are much more moral than the religion they follow.
Exactly. Like people will go beyond, and we do this with a variety of things, right? Not just religion. We make judgment calls on a day-to-day basis about how best we think we could be in the world. And I think we're all dealing with these tensions. We're presented with moral quandaries on a daily basis. And I think how we navigate those and the tools we use to navigate those are varied. So for some people, you might be presented with a moral problem, and your religion helps you get out of that problem. It gives you maybe a simple way to exit that problem. For you might have exactly the same person presented with a different moral problem, and in that instance, their religion doesn't give them the way out, but a course that they recently did on philosophy helps them to think through it. So I view all of these as different tools for thinking through moral problems. Differently, philosophy, where one views itself as a critical as the only answer, I don't think that there is one way of finding your way out of a moral quandary. And that's what makes it a moral quandary, right?
Yeah.
Because the answer is not simple. And as an individual in a social setting, you are going to pull on different tools in different ways in different instances. But for me, a guiding principle currently, and it hasn't always been, I think my social world and who I'm around do shape how I think we can't disavow how important social settings and social networks are in helping us decide what is right and what is wrong. A social norm is a really powerful dictator, sometimes compelling you to go against what you actually think is right and wrong.
Yeah.
But for myself, increasingly, it's a question of responsibility and of locatedness. So one, recognizing that I'm part of an entangled, messy web of relations that stretch beyond my home into the country I live in, into countries that live far beyond me, right? The meal on my plate represents not only where I am now, but also potentially countries that are across oceans, plants that have come from different spaces. And I need to be cognizant of that. So one, recognizing that I'm in an embedded world full of entangled relations, and two, taking responsibility for that. And I think that responsibility is two-tiered as well. There's an individual responsibility. There's recognizing that the choices I make on a day-to-day basis matter, whether it's choosing not to eat an animal today. That's an individual choice that matters. And I think that we really need to realize that individual choices do matter. But at the same time, putting them in context of larger institutional responsibility as well, that one individual should not say, I have no power because governments and institutions, they determine everything. You do have a power in your day-to-day life, but also recognizing that these bigger institutions that drive a lot of trade and a lot of happenings and dictate a lot of our entanglements should also be held to account.
And ultimately, those institutions are made up of and driven by individuals. We're not just consumers. We can also be voters and stand for office and be managers and leaders and employees and shareholders and stakeholders and letter writers. And,
But I just think that when saying what matters, you need to recognize that there are two that we are embedded, and that there are two scales of responsibility. To not disavow how much responsibility you can have as an individual because the problem seems so big, but also to not just locate the problems at the individual level, to say and see that there is a responsibility that we should expect from governments and from bigger institutions. So that's where I locate my ethics and morals, is like, where do I fit and how do I cause the least amount of harm in the decision I'm about to make. And it's not always perfect, right? Like, you make mistakes all the time.
And
Yeah.
I'm very sympathetic to, in the same way as we spend a lot of time talking about epistemological uncertainty, because the universe is a very brain-bendingly complex place. You also hint at a moral uncertainty as well. What is the right moral system? Is it deontology or some set of rules or virtues or consequentialism? And I'm very sympathetic to that sort of moral uncertainty about that maybe there is no perfect way of working this stuff out. And that's partly why the idea of sentientism deliberately stays neutral on all that stuff and says, look, there's loads of different moral systems. I'm uncertain about which is the right one. But one thing that I think that can cut through a lot of those moral systems is your moral considerability. Some people will call it a moral circle. So when you think about all of the different entities in the world around us, which of those matter? And you used what I think is an important word of harm, there, which I think is central, because whatever your moral system is, at the root of it is something about causing harm or benefiting other entities. And that's quite an interesting journey for some people.
Yeah.
About, how does their moral circle develop over time, if it even is a circle. And it would be interesting to know how you've gone through that journey. Did you, start out with a very broad moral circle as it shifted, as you thought about humanity as a whole? At what point did you start taking non-human animals seriously as objects of ethical consideration?
Yeah, before I answer that, I do want to just say, same as how with the epistemological question, I pointed to concerns on both ends. I want to point to concerns on both ends with the moral consideration too.
Yeah.
That when contending with a moral dilemma, yes, there are many ways to look at and consider answers to what could be the best way forward here. But I don't want to necessarily encourage throwing up of hands in all situations either, because I do think sometimes people are presented with a way in which they could do better. We could all do better. But then you're given these generalist answers of everyone's doing the best they can, or I can't think of good examples now, but where folks are not necessarily taking responsibility, where it is just, this is an individual choice, or this is that there are ways of trying to not look at how you are embedded, to try and just suspend that embeddedness and not take responsibility. And I'm not in saying that there are varied ways of contending with and really grappling. And when I say grapple, like sitting with and being with that discomfort and thinking, okay, this is a shitty and hard decision. And sometimes it's not that shitty and hard. Sometimes what is a better way forward is quite plain and obvious. I think you need to be compassionate that people are dealing with this in their own ways and in their own timelines. But at the same time, I do think, so I am vegan now, and in the beginning of that vegan journey, I was very like, yeah, everyone, you do you, it's your choice. And I found that people were often quite confessional. As soon as they would find out that you're vegan, like as soon as people were doing something, they'd be like, oh, I'm definitely cutting down on meat, and they would tell you these things, and I would often give, which I don't think is necessarily wrong. It's, yeah, okay, that's great, because I think just by virtue of being in conversation with this person, I'm being subversive. They are currently contending with their own choices, which is great. But at the same time,
engaging with the topic at least.
Exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, I do think that they might be seeking some catharsis from me saying, oh, it's fine. Everything you're doing is fine. We're all on our own journeys.
Yeah.
I'm just increasingly wary of those open-ended answers. I'd much rather be direct about what the implications are of those choices. I'm not trying to belittle anyone, but just being. So sorry, I'm going to come to your answer now, but I just wanted to put that caveat in there too, that as much as there are varied ways to contend with a moral decision, I do think that sometimes we use that variance of option as a get out of jail free card to not really contend with how difficult those choices are.
Yeah.
And in terms of moral consideration and circles, I definitely know that there's some contention around circles and expanding circles. And same as how I view decisions based on the social setting. I think that this is also based on social settings. But for me, animals were not always part of it. Yeah. Being a vegan, I've been a vegan now for about 4 years, maybe 5 now. And even being a vegetarian wasn't even on my radar. It wasn't something I thought about. And this is just, now in hindsight, I'm like, how did I not see it? But it just wasn't, it just didn't register. It was a non-starter. It was a non-factor. I just didn't think that feathers in my jacket actually came from an animal. They were just feathers in my jacket. I didn't think that what was on my plate, I would speak about it as being a cow or a chicken, but there wasn't really a connection that this was
Yeah.
being that once had a life and died.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there was no connection there. And obviously I'd seen all these horrible videos of what goes on in factory farms, but somehow I'd managed to disavow that. That's not what's going on with my meat, right? That's not real. That's like an extreme example. And then I would continue with my day. It really didn't impact me. But I do think that over time, I think subversion is a really powerful word, because I like to view any worldview as imagine a vase, like a perfectly crafted vase, and you've got this idea and it's perfect, but every conversation and every little video chips that vase. There's a little crack that happens in this idea, and you might not see it. It's a small little blemish and you can't see it. But over time, as these small subversive hits hit your very solid idea, eventually there's going to be a moment when that idea cracks. And that happened for me. My husband was now he had gotten into a Facebook argument with someone about veganism, who had in essence said that you can't call yourself an animal lover and eat meat, which I still say is wrong. I think that we are more complicated and we tend to contradict ourselves constantly, that I do think you can do both of those things. Like, we're just contradictory beings. But this led him down a path of just trying to figure things out. And I was passively listening to videos he was listening to in the background. And some person who I don't know said, listen, if you want to eat factory farmed animals, go ahead, do it. But if you're going to eat them, just know and acknowledge that who you are eating on the plate has gone through that system. It was a very straightforward, simple, and that was the thing that broke my vase. That was the moment where I had an internal jolt of, shit, I'm part of this. And whether I like it or not, I now have a decision as to whether or not I live in line with my views. I can talk about how much I love things, and I can talk about how much I care about the planet. And honestly, the environmental ethics weren't even part of the picture. This was purely an animal ethics decision. And we took an 8-month journey. We were quite scared. There's a lot of talk out there about how being vegan is unhealthy. And I'm happy to say that we cycled 6,000 kilometers across Central Asia on a vegan diet. We went through China. We went through Mongolia on a bicycle. We managed to, I think there were some mistakes where people possibly gave us things and we weren't too sure what was going on. But the vast majority, we ate vegetables, and there are some of the best vegetables in the world in China, I can tell you now. The leaf selection and the mushroom selection are just out of this world. And we're healthy and we're happy, and and then obviously after we made an 8-month deadline, we worked towards it. We figured out recipes. We went for blood tests. We were like, okay, like the vegan thing, we're going to die, but still it's important to do. And no, we ended up being the healthiest we've ever been. And then slowly the environmental ethics started to come into play as well, that this isn't just a decision about animals, but how these industries are killing the planet. Where does the cow poop go? Anyway, sorry, I'm rattling on, but it's not circles, complicated entanglements.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the circle is, it's a simple concept, and I think it's useful in that sense, but it implies concentric expansion. It implies that certain things are in the center or are prioritized in certain different ways. So I think when you dig into it, maybe it's not, as accurate as it should be. And the reality is much more messy.
Sure. And also recognizing that animals they're not a monolithic category either. So how we consider some animals and our social relations with them is very different. Like, how do we consider our social relations with the cow or a lion? What are the responsibilities and the contours of our relationship?
Yeah. And I think what you were talking about with the variety of moral approaches and that moral uncertainty, again, it echoes in a way what we're talking about with the epistemology, because your one mistake is to think you have the perfect moral system. And the other mistake, I think, is to give up completely. And I think that's one of the dangers of some of the people who like the postmodernist approach can end up being drawn into a sort of moral relativism that almost to my mind, is just abandoning morality completely, because it's saying, who are we to judge? It's their culture. They've negotiated this moral system in a different way from mine. And I think we should respect that, right? Because people will come to different perspectives. But if that moral system includes stoning people for adultery, or throwing gay people off roofs, or telling small children that they're going to burn in hell forever if they don't pray enough, for me, I am comfortable condemning those, not because the moral system is different, but because of the harm they're causing. And so in a way, I'm very open-minded about different moral systems, but the root of all of them has to be a moral concern for the suffering, the life, the death, the flourishing of sentient beings. And that's the grounding for me. And then we can argue about rules or different systems on top of that. But the idea of being so relativistic and so uncertain about morality that you allow and refuse to condemn moral systems that directly and very clearly and incontrovertibly oppress and harm sentient beings, that's where I call a halt there. And I say, look, I'm very comfortable explaining those harms, saying they're needless, and saying that that's not a good moral system. There are some moral systems that are immoral in my view.
Yeah, it's something that because I do think that we need to respect different cultures and different ways of doing things. And for a long time, I was thinking, before I called myself a feminist, this for me was also like a dirty word, right? What is a feminist? And I came from a setting where things were quite conservative, and there was now concern that so my first master's was a gender studies degree, and it was purely because I didn't understand what the concept of gender meant. So I was like, okay, I'm going to get a degree in this. And I'm still...
How many degrees do you have now?
I think this is my 5th now. Is it? Yeah, this will be my 5th. And that sounds obnoxious, but it's how I stay disciplined with learning stuff. Other people are really good at just falling down like YouTube channels and being disciplined that way. I'm not, unfortunately, that way inclined. But then I realized, so eventually I came around and I was like, okay, when feminists believe that there are different ways to do feminism and different ways to believe you are a feminist and to contend with patriarchal structures. But overall, the common tenet is that women should have, and a variety of genders should have, moral consideration and should be viewed as people and persons and have access to rights. And then I realized, but feminism, I realized at some point I was like, okay, is this also just relativism? Is this leaning towards just respecting all cultures no matter how they deal with or believe women should behave? And then I was like, no, because feminism at its core is critical, saying that something is broken and we need to contend with that. And I think it's the same thing with veganism.
I agree. And I think that's one of the things I find frustrating is that there are some people who will call themselves feminist who won't call out, for example, the system of guardianship in Saudi Arabia because they're nervous about criticizing another culture. Whereas to my mind, no, those women are being constrained and imprisoned. And don't be shy about calling that out. We should respect other cultures and other ways of thinking. But when the harm is clear and uncontrovertible, whether it's to whoever it is, let's not abandon those people because of being too sensitive about different cultures.
I do think, though, that to some extent that's also easier said than done. Because as much as you might have one system of oppression that's working to diminish women in some ways, you've got racist systems that are operating as well, and people utilizing. And I think that this is where the real difficulty lies, is that all of these different things, racism, sexism, speciesism, they're interlocked and they're also shaping one another, right? Like how racism operates is channeled and shaped by how sexism operates, and is also channeled and shaped by how, I can't say speciesism properly, and it is easy to see how some people that might be taking a hard line on how women are treated in Saudi Arabia are also using racist discourses to do it. And add to that the current context in which speaking your mind online can get you fired or can get you having serious backlash on social media. Add that kind of fear of being wrong. Add that kind of fear of being, and unfortunately that kind of fear is not associated at all that kind of with eating animals, not yet at least. But I think that there is something to contend with about that kind of toxic backlash.
I totally agree. And I think that's a really important concern, is that for some people, they'll use challenging real oppression as a way of doing their own form of oppression, as you say. And that's clearly an issue. And you can see that, I think, to some degree, in that there are, interestingly, some atheist and humanistic organizations who will campaign against some religious forms of animal slaughter without making any statement about factory farming. And you're like, you're resisting a form of religious privilege and dressing it up as though you're trying to help the welfare of those animals. But actually, you don't have any concern for the welfare of all of the other factory farmed animals outside of those systems. So maybe your motivation is actually about challenging those religious privileges rather than. And I think so. So I think again, that's one mistake. If we allow people to challenge an oppression using an oppressive lens, that's a problem. But there's also a problem where we say, because this group are oppressed under some circumstances, we're going to allow them without challenge to continue to oppress people or beings within their own society. And then we abandon them because the group as a whole seems oppressed. There are even more oppressed people within that society. So I think in a way that brings me back to a sort of safety mechanism or a stop check, which is, as you did when you listened to the individual say, you think about who that was on your plate. If you go back to the individual sentient being, human or non-human, and you think about their perspective, to my mind, that's the safety mechanism here. So as long as that's your primary unit of moral consideration and concern, you're concerned about that woman or that man or that pig or that chicken and their perspective, hopefully that provides a sort of safety mechanism. And being oppressed yourself is not an excuse for oppressing others. And I think we can find a balanced way of challenging that.
And I think, so I mean, it's definitely complicated and complex. So let's say you speak to someone about who is within a system that you view as being morally reprehensible, and you start with that individual and you say, what do you think? And they respond saying, this is the way it should be. And this is where the questions of relativism come in and are problematic, because you could have someone at the individual level who is saying, yes, this is right. This is the way it should be. And you, as someone who is not from our country, not from our culture, why do you get a say on what we're doing? And a whole bunch of historical baggage comes into asking that question as well.
Absolutely.
So yes, I think coming to the individual, but also contending with that difficulty, messy thing that you might not agree with this individual, and finding the reasons for why that is without diminutizing where their views come from, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think the route forward or the way forward should be embracing complexity and nuance. And I think, again, this comes to how media currently operates, how we tend to speak of our problems as being categorical. It's this or it's that. It's right or it's wrong.
Yeah.
And I think to bring in that nuance and complexity is not to necessarily embrace relativism. I think there are some lines in the sand, and there are some things that you as an individual need to draw, and as a society, right? Because we are individuals that exist within specific social groups. What does my social group think? And what are we willing to protect? And we need to think through why we are willing to protect that and to what end. Because we're not free-floating individuals. We exist within structures and systems, but we have to be willing to be complicated and nuanced and recognize that we might not have that humility you were speaking about earlier. And because it is and you should definitely be speaking to the people with whose oppression you are concerned with. Their voices should be there, and what they are saying should be listened to. But you also need to prepare yourself that you might encounter a situation where you might not agree with that person. And what does that mean? What are the implications of that? I don't have the answers. I'm in the job of just setting up a whole bunch of difficult questions, but it's certainly good to think through.
I agree. And I think it's partly acknowledging that complexity and that richness and the distinctiveness of different people's perspectives, and have humility about your ability to even understand that perspective. And I think it's also engaging with compassion, even with people you disagree with deeply. And that doesn't mean you have to be weak or you have to appease people who are causing harm, but you still, and that's the challenge. It's easy to be compassionate to people you agree with, but being compassionate with people and others you fundamentally disagree with, I think is important, because without that, it's quite hard to have the humility. And it's quite hard to really deepen your own understanding if you've condemned before you listen and learn.
I agree.
Because the way I'd like to finish these conversations is to really think about the future. And I try and set a slightly optimistic cast, but some of my guests don't want me to do that. So you can take it wherever you like. But I guess the question I'm asking is, if we imagine a situation where more people, you and I don't agree on everything, we'll have different perspectives, but where more people roughly agree with us that we should have a broader moral circle that includes certainly all sentient beings, and that we should have a broad naturalistic high humility way of understanding reality. If we could switch a button and have more people think that way, what do you think that future might look like? And you can choose your own time frame, and how do you think we might be able to get there?
Gosh, I really wish I'd given this a spot more thought before, because I think it's a brilliant question. And I think, so something I heard, I think it was Dinesh Wadi say in a lecture, and I think that's really important about the present and its connectedness to the future is that oftentimes people will view vegans as killjoys and stuff, but I think that we are actively engaged in trying to imagine a future that operates differently. We don't know what that future looks like necessarily, but we are trying to figure out that future through our everyday decisions. So I think that no matter what future the listeners have envisioned for us and animals, I think that placing some weight on what your choices are today and how that could shape whatever beautiful future you have in mind, I think that's really a significant thing. But for the future, I imagine cities. I think that our world is increasingly urbanized, and I think it's going to continue in that way. But I imagine cities that are more embracing of animals and of the variety of more of the natural world. The cities are natural spaces and they are ecologies, and I view them as increasingly less resistant to that fact, maybe embracing plants that grow up on the sides of buildings more, creating highways that stretch from building to building for squirrels to navigate on, embracing the hawks that are there as well, figuring out different architecture that leads to the space being more friendly to animals, and figuring out how this will happen in a way that is also tied to food systems that are less oppressive. So more diverse ways of farming, vertical farming that is embracing seed dispersion and moving away from monocrop, which I do acknowledge that to some extent is necessary to feed the size of our populations. But I envision more dynamic urban spaces where humans are not so separated from animals, and where we are not so violent against animals who intersect our spaces, whether it's a raccoon opening your dustbin or a rat that sneaks in because it wants to get warm, that there's a different solution to killing them. I imagine a world where killing isn't the first answer, where there are more creative, beautiful ways of thinking about how we can deal with these problems, because they are messy and they are sometimes inconvenient, but we have figured it out with ourselves, and it's not always perfect. So I imagine a world where it will be imperfect, but it will be more thoughtful for what those squirrels, raccoons, rats, hawks, what they need in those spaces, and how leaving some spaces alone might also be best for other animals. Maybe imagining different nations. I think the work of Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson. I recently interviewed her on the Animal Turn as well, and she speaks about like political multi-species communities, and I really do think imagining a world in which they're taken seriously as beings, not as property, and I think that for me would be a really beautiful world.
Thank you. That's an inspiring vision, and I love those simple thought experiments of just taking concepts we think of as quite normal for humans, whether it's rights, liberalism, democracy, freedom, autonomy, and just extending the remit of those to other sentient non-human animals. And why not? It won't be trivial, it won't be easy, it might be messy, but it's an inspiring vision to lay out.
Yeah, it's definitely great to think through. I think I might push back on them being simple. I think there are some people that maybe don't think the rights model is the best way forward.
Yeah.
But why not at least think through it, carve out a space where it's a possibility. The idea that they shouldn't have, access to healthcare or access to elderly care or retirement packages for animals that have worked their whole lives for us. And for themselves. Let's start embracing these difficult to understand, but really potentially enriching for our world and theirs. I think we deserve they deserve this kind of consideration. Animals we've been in relationships with for thousands and thousands of years. It's time we consider how we impact their worlds and the responsibility we should take and the actual ways in which we can make the world better and take more responsibility for our embeddedness in it.
Thank you. An inspiring vision. So before we wrap up, what's the easiest way for people to follow you and subscribe to the Animal Turn? I can include links in the show notes, of course. But
if you could, I should be better at just like rattling these off. So both myself and the podcast are on Twitter. So the podcast is The Animal Turn, and I'm Claudia F. Town. So Twitter, I'm new to it, and I'm getting into that. Thank you. And the Animal Turn is, you can find it on any podcasting network. I will be releasing a website for it early next year. I'm still busy building all of that. But if you could give it a listen and potentially a review, that would be really great. But yeah, it's building, it's working. We're currently finishing off a season on animals and experience. I've got 2 more interviews. Actually, we released an episode today with Jonathan Balcom. I keep saying we, like it's a solo show, but it is, I feel like it's a whole community.
It's like a royal we,
yeah. Yeah. But no, it is, I mean, there are sponsors and there are folks that have helped me with music and stuff, so it is a we. But yeah, I released an episode with Jonathan Balcom today, speaking about fish's experiences, and really,
his book is amazing. Yeah.
Oh, he's wonderful. One of the best parts, as I'm sure you're getting to realize, of podcasting is that you get to carve out an hour of someone's life, and someone like Jonathan Balcom or Sue Donaldson, and you get to have an hour of their attention and just pick their brains, which is...
Or Claudia Hirtenfelder.
Yeah, one day. Thank you for including me. I saw in your podcast description, you're like, speak to experts and animal rights activists and lay people like myself. I was like, yes, lay people like myself. But thank you for letting me...
A lay person with only 5 degrees, yes.
Yeah, no, that sounds obnoxious. It's legitimately, it's a compulsion. Don't look at it as a good thing.
It's been a genuine pleasure to talk to you today, and I can't recommend The Animal Turn highly enough. Don't just subscribe to it, but make sure you listen to all the back episodes, because you've had some fascinating conversations. So
yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan, for the support. And you were one of the first people to reach out to me on Twitter and actually extend an arm and speak to me about the podcast itself, mine and yours. So thank you, and I look forward to listening to more of your episodes here as well.
Thank you. I will see you on Twitter, and it's great to have you on our Facebook group too. So cool. I'll let you go get on with the rest of your day. Thank you for spending so much time with me. Take care.
Cheers. You too.